Before the actual video starts, I want to apologize in advance. I do not have a professional recording setup, so you might hear some sound inconsistencies. Also, you might want to speed up the video. When this video is finally out, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, the official sequel to Breath of the Wild, will have been released about 3 weeks ago already. While 2023 is a year in regards to video gaming that looked promising from the get-go, as many highly anticipated games like Hogwarts Legacy, Star Wars Jedi Survivor, or Final Fantasy XVI would come out, and as far as it's not gonna be delayed, even Silent Hill 2, a remake of one of the most well-known horror games of all time, it still cannot be overstated how Tears of the Kingdom was probably the one particular game that most people were waiting for and which could easily end up fulfilling most of a consumer's wishes. Breath of the Wild, having originally been produced as a Wii U title on which I also played it, helped the Nintendo Switch as an incredibly successful launch title. I still remember talking about the game with a friend in university, as he's a massive Zelda fan as well, and he had just bought the Switch back in the day. Now, one thing I can say beforehand, I really like this game. And I like it a lot more than Breath of the Wild. And yet, this video is not supposed to be about me praising the game non-stop, as it would be disingenuous. I'm always very critical towards games, especially those I like. And if they happen to be games that are overall very popular, videos such as this one might also not be for everyone. So take this as the disclaimer. Ordinarily, whenever something or somebody is criticized, it is advised that you start out with something positive and then go on with something negative and so on. However, I think it is better to get my biggest gripes of a game out of the way and then end on a more positive note. So, first things first. What games like Elden Ring, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom all have in common is their primary selling point, the open world structure. And I know for a lot of people that is a great thing, and they play those games especially for that alone. However, for me, unfortunately, that is the greatest weakness. And as far as I'm concerned, for nothing they have to offer, these games actually need to be open world games. Now I know, obviously, open world games are very often made with the intention to provide a more individual gaming experience and also reward the explorer's curiosity. However, they are very often designed in a way that just does not work for me in many regards. And unfortunately, Tears of the Kingdom also has those problems. Now, one of the things that I always think of as very unfortunate is that whenever some developers design an open world game, they can never be bothered putting much effort into making the world itself look special and unique. And I think if you have a game, or you want to make a game which focuses so much on the world, then the world's design should also very much be considered to be very, very outstanding. And unfortunately, no matter how pretty Breath of the Wild / Tears of the Kingdom are, they do not look unique or special in any way. They look like a very ordinary fantasy world. As far as I'm concerned, you could even remove the characters and the names, and then the world could easily be put into another game. And that's what I think of as a pity, because I think as far as world design goes, as far as Hyrule was designed in older games, it always had recognition value. And when open world games are made, very often developers just put a hill here and there, a forest here and there, a lake, a few mountains, or 50 different ruins, which, by the way, always is also a part of open world design for some reason, because they cannot come up with new ideas. And that's something that I think is a problem. It's very unoriginal. And before anybody misunderstands me here, I'm not complaining about the fact that there are mountains and lakes in the game, because obviously that's just normal environment. But if you design that stuff and place it all over your world map, then design it in a way that it has, as I just said before, recognition value. Make it part of the game's personality. What I'm talking about is, do not just create so many hills and puddles of water and patches of grass and trees to fill out the whole world map, because you still need some stuff and you have some assets that you can still use somewhere else. If you just do that so you can fill out the world map without any actual meaning and without giving your world proper personality, and you just want to place a random object somewhere, you might as well just make a smaller world, because it's just meaningless then. Sure, the world is pretty, but that in and on itself is not enough for me. I do not want to remember a game world just for being pretty. I expect a bit more than that when it comes to the creative design. I will always remember what the natural environment of old Zelda games looked like, because they were not bloated and faceless worlds. So as long as we're not talking about natural environment that is extremely distinct looking, like the Deco Tree or the Death Mountain, I will not remember anything about Tears' environment. Probably. Same is not the case for the older games. They're, of course, a lot more restrictive, but there was a lot more care put into each and every distinct place. And while obviously they've also had a few randomly placed things here and there, because they were designed to be smaller games, they had a very distinct feel to them, a very distinct personality. You could actually associate the world's design with that respective game. And as I said before, if I see Breath of the Wild, or Tears of the Kingdom, or a lot of other open world games, so I do not just want to blame Nintendo for their own choices of how they made those games, because other developers also designed their open world games this way. I just do not see a distinct world. I do not see me remembering this world as the world of Tears of the Kingdom, as the world of Breath of the Wild. I have a lot more criticism about the game. However, I think we're gonna get to something more positive now. I'm gonna get to the negative ones later again. The first good thing that I want to say about this game is the same thing that I would have also said about Breath of the Wild if I had reviewed it, and that is that the game is incredibly atmospheric. Now, as much as I want to complain about how the world's design is not unique or not special, and I think I have made my point very clear about that, nevertheless, the way the game is presented to you, whether it's through its looks or, through the return of the piano that you hear sometimes, or through splendid lighting, I'd be a fool to claim that the intense atmosphere that is being created does not have the power to captivate most of the player base, me included. And that, of course, is already worth a lot when it comes to the making of a product. Now, this is obviously something where not diverging too far from other games helps a lot, because if you design an open world game and you want to show your consumer a lot of nature and a lot of different weather effects, the sunset, or if there is some corruptive force like, Ganondorf's gloom in this case, you can really do a lot to just reel in the consumer and make the consumer feel what's going on in this world, and the game itself does a splendid job of that. Now, I've played by far, far worse games that did not make up for the things that they were lacking, so don't misunderstand me and my soft rants here. When it comes to the whole atmosphere, the atmospheric perspective, it is just a fantastic game. I would say it is even more atmospheric than Breath of the Wild, and Breath of the Wild was already pretty atmospheric. The Legend of Zelda was always pretty good when it came to establishing atmosphere, and neither Breath of the Wild nor Tears of the Kingdom have to hide from the other games there, because they do definitely not do less of a job. And I think, and originally that was part of one and the same point in my script, the more you get to the relevant parts of the game, so the more you approach your story, the stronger and the more intense the atmosphere gets, the more it might actually fascinate you and win you over. And this was definitely something that was one of my most favorite parts of the game. It's not really something that I can explain all too well. You might not even be able to really get what I mean through the bit of footage that I can provide here. I think it's something that you really need to experience for yourself. Now, another one of my gripes with the game is something that actually a few people, or maybe even many people, agree with, and that is the overall size of the game. There are people who don't have any problems with that, but I personally think the game is too big for what it has to offer. Old Zelda games were smaller and were streamlined, but they still had their own corners and hidden spots, which would reward you with heart pieces, for example, if you actually bothered exploring. In Tears of the Kingdom, as well as a lot of other open world games, the vastness oftentimes stands in your way of doing something specific, as you get so easily lost in it, and you might not have an idea what to do or where to find something, so that ultimately you are forced to look up a guide or a YouTube video, which of course defeats the purpose of the whole exploration thing in an open world game. And it's actually kind of funny that I'm talking about getting lost in the game, because I'm not talking about getting lost through being distracted with other tasks, but you are actually getting lost because the game itself is so big, and you are oftentimes asked to find just very common things that you just don't know where to find. sometimes for some tasks you might be getting some hints, but they might end up being very vague, if not cryptic, because even if you are told to find some item or some person around or in a certain area, that area might be so big that without looking it up, you might easily run past that item or that person. I actually was looking for things that had nothing to do with a task, but I wanted to collect some very normal items. And one of them was ice related, so I looked in a snowy area. And where I was looking for some items, now that's an over-exaggeration of course, but for miles, I could not find anything at all. No enemies, nothing. And that was not the only place in the game where it was running and running and running and there would not be anything. And even if there would be something, and sometimes it would really just be like 2 enemies or a few plants. So much of the game, and that was also the case in Breath of the Wild, is just unused space. And if you happen to find something that it's nothing special at all, maybe some scaffolding with some bokoblins, or maybe some ruins with a treasure chest, but that's actually not even what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the empty spaces. They're really empty spaces. And the underground area is even worse. The underground area, just as the sky area, has some story-related places, and of course you can also find some treasure chests here and there, but especially the underground area is very, very empty. And at that point, just as I said previously, I really wonder, why would you even bother creating such places? So yeah, I'm definitely not a fan of the many bokoblin and moblin camps and the many ruins and puddles of water where you might find a treasure chest. And this actually bleeds into my next complaint, which I will cover later in the video, so please be patient. It will be about unoriginal tasks, and how things could have been probably better. Anyway, very obviously that stuff is nothing special, and yet I would take that any time over me running through a valley where nothing can be found. But nevertheless, it's definitely, at least in my eyes, not acceptable. So, Nintendo, please, if you make a sequel to this game, and it's also as big as this game, as Breath of the Wild, or maybe even bigger next time, please make it a bit more meaningful and not just fill the space with some bokoblin camps or ruins or, good lord, empty valleys. It's really funny because last year I criticized Breath of the Wild, but not in a YouTube video, and I talked about how the game was also very empty at times, and was lacking substance, and some person responded, and just as it is with every game that is criticized and has a fan base, that person would deny what I said, and said, no, that's not true, you didn't play the game. Now, I can assure you I have played Breath of the Wild for approximately 150 hours, and my Switch shows me that I have played Tears of the Kingdom for over 130 hours, so I definitely know what I'm talking about here, and what that person would use as a counter-argument was that stuff like shrines and those mazes existed in Breath of the Wild, and of course those things exist and I don't deny that. I fully acknowledge their existence, but that does not mean that the other stuff that I mentioned is wrong. So, in any way, yes, the shrines exist, and also those mazes, which also lead to shrines, and more recognizable places, which of course are the villages and the castle, of course. And I really like them. But what I'm trying to say here is you could easily remove stuff that does not really contribute much to the game, and I think it would result in a much better game. But as promised, I will talk about that later. Now for some anecdotes. Those of you who have collected the tiers might remember that Impa is included when it comes to the storytelling, at least a bit. And once you've done all that stuff, she keeps telling you about how she's going to do some research about how to revert Zelda. And I thought that this would lead to a side quest which would eventually lead to the secret ending, or the true ending, which would include Zelda getting turned back into her Hylian form. Now, of course, that was not the case, because it's part of the ordinary ending, and what Impa said was completely meaningless. But I thought that it would actually mean something. Or another thing that was fairly cryptic for me was that before you could actually unlock the water temple, they were talking about the floating island and that you would have to shoot an arrow with the Zora scale through a droplet. And I actually was on the correct island, but I could not for the life of me find the droplet, which would form from floating rocks, which of course I did not know. And it's unfortunate because for the shrines that I finished and for the dungeons, I did not look up anything, no videos, no guides, but for some things leading to certain dungeons or for some side quests, unfortunately I had to look things up. Now, of course, vague or even cryptic descriptions and explanations or hints for certain tasks or side quests are not bound to just big-sized games or overall games with very large world maps. But in case of games with smaller world maps, at least you have a greater chance to accidentally stumble upon the correct solution. And if I have to look for a certain item and the hint is always gonna be found somewhere in that area, but that is one big ass area, it's gonna be unnecessarily difficult. So this is one of the many problems where such a big world map, such a big overworld, is just in your way, at least in my eyes. Another somewhat funny story is that I ran around with Link for at least 20 to 25 hours with him being topless because I could not find any clothing store as I did not know of the lookout landing. I ran past it 2 or 3 times when I visited the castle area, but I did not actually notice it. And I arrived in Kakariko and Hateno, and of course both of them also have clothing stores, but they are both locked behind side quests. Well, Kakariko not, but unless you do the side quest for the clothing store in Kakariko, every single piece of clothing is very, very expensive. And at that point in time, I did not have that amount of rupees. And so it actually took me until Garon City, where I could finally buy something for Link. To say that this was pissing me off is definitely an understatement. And I just was getting even more furious when I got to both mentioned villages. And I would have had actual clothing stores in front of me, but they would not actually give me a, well, realistic possibility to buy the clothes there. Immediately, at least. Anyway, I think that's enough for the quote-unquote rant. when it comes to how the scale of a game might not be all that great when whatever game it is and whatever gaming world it is not filled with any proper meaning, or when the sheer size of the game might actually be more confusing for you in many regards. However, one last thing that I want to say about this is Tears of the Kingdom has the towers that you can unlock. And the towers, as well as the teleporters of the shrines, of course, are used for fast traveling as well as to get to a certain height. The problem here is a lot of people get from one shrine to the next, activate the teleporters and activate the towers, and from that point on they will never ever bother visiting anything around those areas again. Of course, there's always a certain player base that does care about that, but if there are so many people who do not care about that, then maybe the world itself is not alluring enough. And I think that is something to consider. You could easily downsize Hyrule by 2/3, and you would not really lose anything. You could still hide a lot of things that people who want to explore the world can find and be rewarded with, and you could focus on giving the world a lot more personality and something that is a lot more moral. Basically, everything I can praise Tears of the Kingdom for would also be something that I could have praised Breath of the Wild for if I had made a video about it, except in many cases Tears of the Kingdom improves on all of those things, which a lot of people that reviewed Tears of the Kingdom already also stated before me. The combat system from Breath of the Wild makes a return, and of course in Breath of the Wild, at least I suppose that a lot of people would agree with me, it was already displayed to be pretty stylish, and it is pretty cool and stylish here as well. Now unfortunately it is fairly simplistic because Link does not even have the special techniques that he had in games like Wind Waker or Twilight Princess, but it definitely does the job. Link is portrayed as very agile, he has his backflips, he has his side steps, he has in Breath of the Wild as well as in Tears of the Kingdom his Flurry Rush, which is, with a whole Matrix bullet time style, something that a lot of people can always, be won over with. I also never really had a lot of problems with the weapons breaking. I know that's something that a lot of people dislike. They already dislike that in Breath of the Wild, but I don't really mind it that much. And of course, fusing materials and weapons together now is a thing, and I think that's a good addition to the combat system. Of course, you can use it for more than just the combat system. You can now fuse weapons or sticks together with rocks to improve on your whole mining and break other rocky walls, even though that's not the only way you can break rocky walls and other crystals or whatever. But it's a nice addition to the game. And of course, it's also something where your own curiosity plays a large role, because whenever you fuse a weapon together, you might actually be interested in what that weapon will look like. I thought of it as really cool when I found a Lizalfos with some scythe-shaped horn, and I knew, oh yes, I want to fight that Lizalfos, I want to get that item, and then I want to see what my scythe weapon will look like. It is a bit unfortunate that, in their essence, a lot of fused weapons still belong to one of the primary classes. Like, if you fuse a scythe to a spear, it will still be swung like a spear. If you fuse a scythe to a broadsword, it will still be used like a broadsword. So in essence, of course, it still is a broadsword. And I think they could have done a bit more with it, but nevertheless, it is definitely neat. I also like that they this time decided to go with a bit more different bosses when it comes to the mirror design, but I will talk about it later in the dungeon section of the video. After all, they are dungeon bosses. Let's just say that I'm glad that this time they put a bit more effort into the boss design when it comes to what they actually look like, because normally in Zelda games bosses look pretty original, and that's been missing in the prequel. And the combat itself is also a bit more demanding. I was really bad at doing the flurry rush in Breath of the Wild, and this time I pretty much had to at least somewhat learn it, especially for the finale. However, I think that the combat, when it comes to certain types of enemies, especially the white versions of certain enemies, oftentimes is a bit too unfair or demanding, because they are so artificially strong that you are pretty much forced to either do a lot of dungeons, or go and brew a lot of potions, or perfect the flurry rush. You are basically forced to do something, and yeah, I think that goes against the whole play the way you want idea. And by that, I obviously do not want to complain about how the game is so incredibly hard and that all enemies were so challenging for me, because I've played a lot harder games like Sekiro or Elden Ring. I've also played games like The Last of Us or Horizon Zero Dawn at their highest difficulty levels. I occasionally do that whenever I want to do that. For me personally, the Phantom Ganon Quintet in Hyrule Castle was the hardest battle in the game, because I could not endure more than 2 attacks and I would just die. And I remembered only many attempts later that he could use stuff like bomb arrows. And I had only a defense stat of, I think, 6, and also no potions that would raise my defense. Therefore, it was a pretty hard battle for me. Those who already did the battle know that those Phantom Ganons can get fairly challenging, and you only fight one at the same time whenever you would finish off those gloom hands that are roaming the overworld. It's also neat that those Phantom Ganons are more or less some way to prepare you for the final boss, kind of like the Guardians in Breath of the Wild were some sort of preparation for the final boss in the prequel. Now let's proceed with the last really sort of negative point for me, then I will go to the more mixed points, and then I will finish the video with one last positive, the biggest positive for the entire game in my eyes, and which is the reason why I like this game a lot, even with all those complaints. And the negative, big negative, is I think that there are a lot of side quests, and I'm calling not just any task that is mentioned in the log a side quest, but also other things that you can do in the game as well. A lot of them are totally unnecessary, if not busy work. And a lot of them are even repetitive. Like, you can fight a lot of monsters. I don't care that there are 20 Hinoxes or 20 Lynels, 20 of those Hydras. 1 copy each would have been sufficient. Same for stuff like fetch quests, Korok seed collecting to troll the player. The very fact that for the Great Fairy Fountains to be unlocked, you need not only find certain musicians, but you also need to do some fetch quests, like finding honey or sunset fireflies, which pissed me really off, so I ended up buying them instead. And that's the typical busy work that you know from a lot of games, especially RPGs. And of course I'm used to that, but I don't think there should be that many of them in the game, especially not when, again, the primary selling point is the open world and what you can do. So I think those should just have been reduced, and maybe a few other tasks should have been included instead. While thinking about this video, I actually realized that there are certain ways of how to improve on the whole exploration side and the whole questing side of this game, which of course is basically everything about this game minus the story. And it was funny because I did not even realize at first that The Legend of Zelda has perfect elements that no other game has, which could have been used for the exploration or the quests. And maybe you are on my side here, because I think that the very fact that Nintendo insists so much on all those Zelda games being connected with the whole time tree theme, they could have easily brought back ruins of certain temples, which might be somewhat functional and serve as optional dungeons, or you could still find certain items, ancient relics of the past, like the Ocarina of Time, for which you might find song sheets. For example, the Song of Storms, which could cancel thunderstorms or start thunderstorms, or the Sun's Song, which could reset the day for you, or even the Song of A Link to the Past, for which you could actually summon the duck, and it could help you to get some height. Of course, you would need some restrictions for those items, and I also think items like the Cane of Somaria from A Link to the Past, which can summon a block out of thin air, would be perfect for this game. Or the hook shot / long shot. I know that this actually takes away from the idea that you can climb in this game, or that you can rest to get to the next day, but it's not like those items could be used infinitely. You could get a cooldown for those items. And when it comes to items like the hookshot, for example, through a quest or through some thorough searching, you could get an additional chain to upgrade it to the long shot. There are so many ways of how to use what's been pre-established through other Zelda games, and which would actually give proper meaning, unique meaning to this game, to make it feel like something other games could not imitate, and to show you, okay, this game has a history, and that there is actually something that combines and connects all those games, and that this is the culmination of everything. This is the ultimate Zelda experience, and all those things from the past could be used perfectly for exploration. You could find more than just ruins of the Lon Lon farm, as people have shown in YouTube videos and screenshots over the course of the last years, or ruins that they thought of as ruins of the Arbiter's grounds. Now you could easily make something that could be explored or interacted with, or use those things as optional dungeons. People are missing dungeons anyway, Breath of the Wild as well as Tears of the Kingdom. And I think, as an addition to all that, you could actually pick up an idea from The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. In Twilight Princess, the spirit of the Ocarina of Time / Majora's Mask, Link, teaches Twilight Princess Link special techniques. You could easily combine the whole exploration idea with what Twilight Princess established. You could find something like different heroes' graves all over Hyrule, and each and every Link spirit could actually be found and teach this current Link a special technique, or tell him something about the past, and you would actually be able to feel this has relevance. This is truly something that happens so many years, so many millennia after the old games. This is truly the ultimate reincarnation and retelling of the everlasting fight of good versus evil. I think Zelda would just be perfect to give the player some actual reasons for exploring, and not just something like, okay, oh, there's the statue, could you look what that statue is about for me, and if you do, you get some rupees, or could you fetch some apples or some honey for me, or oh, this musician will actually only join his fellow musicians if you get some item for him, and then you need to drive those musicians to the next great fairy fountain. Why do the same boring busy work in every game that could really be in every game, instead of making something unique to Zelda? It's not like you would have to drop all those very common tasks, but I think ideas such as the previously mentioned ones would be really cool. And since somebody might interject and say, well, there can be some weapons found in the underground area. No, that's not what I mean. I do not mean weapons being found as some sort of random weapons. I mean that you actually get them with actual meaning, and that this is probably even the primary point of exploration in the game. Just discovering things from the past. I don't even want to include the shrines and other more original ideas in my complaint about the boring and repetitive tasks, even though there are also some shrines which are repetitive, but I'll get to that in the next section of the video. Actually, these guys could be former Link spirits, but if they really are, then it sucks especially that we did not get a proper introduction, explanation, and implementation of them in the game. All the other stuff could definitely stay somewhat in the game. However, it's not something that justifies, or at least in my eyes, it's definitely not something that justifies that The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom and also Breath of the Wild were treated as these pioneers and these legendary masterpieces, games that have never been made before. It's the same thing as with games like Elden Ring. As said at the beginning of the video, I like all these games a lot, but I take issue with people rating these games as legendary games, masterpieces, one of a kind, the best games to have ever been made. I like all these games. I would not have played them for over 100 hours each. But so many of those games, especially those open world games that I play, have too much in common. They're not necessarily bad things, but they are things that I've seen before, and they were not implemented in a better or more outstanding way, and when they were not better implemented or, more innovative or anything that makes them more memorable, and thus they are not better than other games that I do not call legendary or masterpieces, then how could I call those games masterpieces? So, as far as I'm concerned, those are good games, very good games actually, just not incomparably good. They are just too much of the same. As a matter of fact, when it comes to the sheer mass of what you can do in this game, just as with other open world games, you will always find some person having written something like, oh, I've played game X for 200 hours, I'm 200 hours into the game already, and I'm nowhere close to having finished everything this game has to offer. Well, yes, this might sound impressive at first, but if a game has, let's say, 1,000 things to offer, but those 1,000 things have only tasks which belong to 5 different categories, then, well, that's not that impressive anymore in my eyes. So I would rather have seen something resembling any of my suggestions. And of course, things like, oh, you will find this Link spirit or this item still, when broken down completely, is nothing else but find this or speak to that person. But it would be Zelda specific. It would have meaning. it would be completely different from go to that cave, find that mushroom, go to that forest, find that honey. Or I think this game, just as basically every other open world game, has so much wasted potential, and that's unfortunate. So even though I definitely have had my fun with Tears, just as I had with Breath of the Wild and Elden Ring and Horizon and everything, all of these games could do much better. And I also think that when it comes to those very generic types of tasks that Tears also has, like you can farm, or basically you even have to farm items to upgrade certain gear, provided that you actually want to do that, of course. And this is incredibly tedious. Of course, we know that from other games as well, and Breath of the Wild also had that, but it's not good to copy tasks from other games and then not learn from their mistakes. You could implement that in a more exciting way, or Tears actually is very bad at this when it comes to getting some items that are more uncommon drops. It is absolutely horrendous to get certain things like tails from Lizalfos enemies. I wanted to fully upgrade the Orni trousers, and I have yet to get it to the very last level because I need 10 Fire Breath Lizalfos tails, and the drop rate is just terrible. This is not a game with RNG encounters. You have to beat the limited amount of Lizalfos enemies, and then you have to wait for them to respawn with a blood moon. So yeah, that's actually terrible. I mean, I guess I could abuse the save system, but that kind of proves that it is not all that well thought out. And this is just one example. It could have learned from a lot of games where people already thought, okay, well, if I have to do that, I'm gonna do it. But it's not necessarily fun. So yeah, overall, I think a lot of people would agree with me on the idea that a lot more old school things and characters and items that would show how things properly tie together would give all of it a lot more meaning. And it would not just become meaningful by tying the story together better, it would also result in just overall a lot more meaning that would be put into the exploration, which would give Zelda Tears of the Kingdom a lot more personality. And of course, I'm not just saying that for Tears of the Kingdom. They should have started that with Breath of the Wild already. Now let's talk about one of the more mixed bags. First, the shrines. I personally think that the shrines got a big improvement this time. I did not do all of them, but I think about 75 or so. Many people complained about certain types of shrines in Breath of the Wild, like those tests of strength with either pretty low or pretty high difficulty. In a way, these shrines also make a return. However, they're combat shrines that focus on one specific thing that you can do in combat, like using your throw command, or the fact that you can sneak around. I think this should actually have been part of the tutorial area, because that's when you learn the actual gameplay, and it is, as far as I'm concerned, not good to actually hide every single combat shrine. They're still a lot better than in the original game, because in the original game you pretty much only had to fight a weaker or stronger enemy, and this time you have to run through an area, at least sometimes it's a bigger area, and have to fight some constructs. And I think it is a bit cheap that they rob you of all your equipment for those tests, but at the same time, it is understandable because otherwise they would just completely bypass the challenge. The mazes, which lead to shrines,
and actually even a really cool armor make a return. And I think the mazes themselves were a highlight in Breath of the Wild. Now this time they have a sky version and a short underground version, which leads to a boss. And there's really not much that I can say about them. I really like them. And these are the kinds of things that Zelda definitely can keep, in my opinion. Of course, the shrines themselves are not really anything, because the actual test is the maze. So even though the Sky versions have shrines as well, and they have short tests, there are also certain other shrines that I will not forget because I spent way too much time on them, because for some reason or another I did not get behind what they actually wanted from me. For example, there was a rotating disc on the wall, and you would have to build some, let's call it an arm, that would shove a sphere over a track. And somehow I did not notice that through the very existence of the spinning disc on the wall, and the fact that such an arm already existed and it was very close to the entrance, they pretty much already gave me the solution. But the problem was that through a shaft, a sphere was shot out, and there was some platform that could move, and some posts that could fuse with the wall. And I somehow thought that you would have to get the sphere to roll into the opposite direction, where those tracks right below the spinning disc, and that with the proper speed, the sphere could fall down the track, which by the way was sort of half circular, and roll all the way from one side to the next. And right on the other side, there was that indentation where the sphere could rest. But that did not work, and eventually I found out that there was this arm which consisted of a post and a platform fused together, sort of a tennis racket, and that you would actually fuse that into the wall where the spinning disc is. So the spinning disc itself, through its mechanism, would move that tennis racket and then move the sphere. There are also some other things, like I really like that in the wind-themed area, around the Orni and the Wind Temple, there are also more wind-themed shrines, where some of those trampoline flying ships suddenly have to be used, or that around the Death Mountain area you have to work more with lava-based tasks, where you also have to use some hydrants then, some sonar hydrants, where you have to cool some of the lava, so you would get some platform to walk on, and of course you could also fuse those platforms together with your Ultra Hand. As said before, I have not done all of the shrines, but I think those little tests where you have to roll a ball through a labyrinth are gone. They were in Breath of the Wild, and you could basically cheat by just flipping over either your Wii U or your Switch, and I have not found any of those tasks. I think some people didn't like them, but I personally think one or two of them would not have been bad. And anyway, I think that they were getting pretty creative with the shrines, and most of them definitely could stay in the game, even though I think that, as in Breath of the Wild, there are too many, but at the same time, at least you get something more memorable for your exploration. And for those of you who have actually bothered watching that much of the video, you know that I wanted more special things to be found to reward your curiosity. I think they did a pretty good job, but maybe they could have improved a bit on the Comet Shrine side, and they should have been placed somewhere else for people to be found early in the game. The next mixed bag point goes to the dungeons. The divine beasts in Breath of the Wild were pretty disliked by a lot of people,
and I personally did not mind them that much. However, I can admit that the Wind Temple, the Fire Temple, the Thunder Temple, Water Temple, and Spirit Temple are a bit better as far as I'm concerned. I'm still a bit disappointed that they are not really resembling the traditional Zelda dungeons, but they tried to make them a bit more similar. It's also really neat that this time you get to use the ability of your companion to be and actually have to use it to unlock the certain areas in the shrines, and that is at least somewhat familiar because those who have played old Zelda games know that halfway into a dungeon you get an item and that you actually have to use it for the rest of the dungeon, normally even for the boss. And they somewhat did it the same way here. It's not exactly the same way, but at least there's some resemblance to it. Unfortunately, when it comes to the dungeons themselves, they all follow the same concept. You have to unlock 4 or 5 locks, and then you actually can get to the boss. And you really only have to find your way to those rooms, which of course you can do in certain different ways because this is an open world game and this flows into the dungeon design as well, which also leads to the very fact that a lot of people kind of cheesed the way of how to navigate through the Fire Temple and used wall or ceiling jumps instead of using the carts all the time. I personally used the carts sometimes, but whenever I could climb to do ceiling jumps, I did that as well. But overall, I think there is definitely some room to improve. They were not horrible, but for those that did not really like the Breath of the Wild Divine Beasts, I think that they will not be that much of an improvement to them. As far as I'm concerned, they're okay, but I prefer the old dungeons a lot more. And I already mentioned the fact that you should be able to find old items, and of course I would recommend some items to actually be found in those dungeons as well. Really, there is no reason for why not to do that. When it comes to the dungeons, I think they were kind of lazy when it came to the cutscenes after having beaten the boss, because the first half of the story that every dead sage is gonna tell you is exactly the same thing, and then when it comes to the second half of their story, it's basically still the same story, but you will see their own respective pictures, and of course the only difference really is that it's a different voice actor. And instead of saying, well, I could not beat Ganondorf with my water attack, the Gerudo one would say, I could not beat Ganondorf with my lightning attack, and so on. So they got a bit of lazy there, and even though it's part of the story, technically it's also part of the dungeons, so I'll mention it here. The bosses themselves were fine and nice. There was some variety this time, but far better and more original than in Breath of the Wild, and I think this time, as we did not get any unamplified Ganons, only a few people will miss them. Some old school players might be happy about the enemy type choices for the bosses, and it was actually the return of variations of very well-known Zelda bosses. Like, one of them was a variation of those Moldor and Molgira enemies, one of them was a Goma incarnation, one of them was an Octorok incarnation, and one of them was a variation of Mathula, or at least something themed, something fitting to the overall Gibdo/Redead theme. So I think that was pretty cool, and of course you also needed your companions there, or at least you were supposed to use them there, as well as do I think it was a very welcome improvement in direct comparison to Breath of the Wild. And of course I hope they keep on improving on so much more. Many people like the boss battles in The Legend of Zelda, so I think that was definitely something that made a lot of people happy. But overall, I would say the dungeons, they were okay. They were definitely not too great, they were not too bad. And I think this whole idea of the open world structure, and that therefore you also are able to solve the dungeons at least a bit in the way you want by getting here and there through your own means, is a bit counterproductive when it comes to the dungeon and puzzle design itself, as the Zelda games always required you to get behind what the developers wanted from you and what they thought you should overcome as an obstacle. And I personally think that it is great to find out if you're clever enough to understand what the developer wanted from you. For me personally, that's a lot more rewarding, because then I know that I've overcome an obstacle without just cheesing my way through it by having built some random crap. The next mixed bag is unfortunately the music. The Legend of Zelda is known for having an incredible soundtrack, and Koji Kondo is one of the absolute best when it comes to composing game music. However, even though Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom have some really, really beautiful themes, everybody who has played the game knows that, especially while roaming the overworld, only very rarely you hear the piano, which of course is also very pretty and serves the atmosphere pretty well, but other than that, you basically only hear music whenever you engage in a battle or whenever you're riding a horse, and then the next time you might hear a theme when you're in a village or in another more important battle, and of course in the ending or some cutscenes. And that I think of as very unfortunate, because while obviously it is to create the atmosphere, playing music in the overworld is also there to create atmosphere and to signalize how epic the adventure is. The Legend of Zelda has incredible Hyrule Field overworld themes. It has a lot of other themes that you can absolutely be mesmerized by. Hearing the Orni theme or the Zora's Domain theme in their respective village or kingdom was so beautiful. It reminded me of Wind Waker and Ocarina of Time, and I would have really, really liked hearing more of the Zelda music while going on the actual adventure. Now, Ganon's theme and the main theme of Tears of the Kingdom, especially when it comes to catching a certain character right at the end of the game, and the mix of certain themes are incredible. But there is a reason why movies like Star Wars have music being played all the time. It's supposed to put emphasis on what this moment actually is trying to tell you, and what you're supposed to feel, and how serious this moment is, or how sad this moment is, or how awesome this moment is. And I really, really think that it is very unfortunate that we did not get to hear more. But of course, during the final scenes, during the finale, and of course also during the secret ending, my god, the main theme of Zelda mixed together with other themes, it was absolutely beautiful. And that's the positive, of course, but unfortunately it does not amount to something better than just a mixed bag. Now for the final point of my video, and the very last positive. The story. Good lord. Granted, a story is not the most deep or complex story to have ever been presented in a game, movie, or book. But it is true that whenever people say, well, it was actually a pretty solid story, it just was not well executed. It was actually a pretty well thought out idea. It just was not well executed. And it's true. And this story, it was really well executed. It is a very classic fairy tale, just like Zelda always has been whenever it had a story. And it is not void of any writing like very old school Zeldas. It's not the best of the best, because I would say that more thought was put in writing games like Twilight Princess or Skyward Sword, but it definitely is a great and really touching presentation of a fairy tale that The Legend of Zelda just is. Ganondorf this time is shown as Ganondorf, so his humanoid form, and that in and on itself is so much of a contribution to the game's story, because if we're being honest, most of us are probably gonna be convinced of an antagonistic force way more when that antagonistic force is an actual humanoid villain and not just some natural force like Calamity Ganon in the last game was. That really plays a large role because we have some actual face to look at, we have some actual character, some actual personality to hate, or maybe even think of as awesome. I mean, many players thought that this was a very impressive and intriguing Ganondorf, and I think the way he was portrayed definitely was intriguing. He was shown as very menacing. As it was not the most complex way he was portrayed and the way the story was written, but this story is just so well executed. It's just portrayed in such a touching way, and in a way where you're just getting so invested. Or at least that was my experience. I don't know if there are people who were not that convinced, but and the cutscenes with the story were some of the moments where the existing music, of course, did a lot of the job. Ganon's theme being played, which I have heard the first time in Zelda: A Link to the Past, just sent me straight back to Zelda: A Link to the Past, or to Twilight Princess. Granted, this Ganondorf is not my favorite Ganondorf, because that would be the one from Twilight Princess, which of course is also the one from Ocarina of Time. But I would say that even though he is not my personal favorite, I think that was the best portrayed Ganondorf. I think it was a bit weird that he was portrayed in such an extremely powerful way, because I guess the Ganon from A Link to the Past is the most powerful Ganon, and it is very weird that he just has one Infinity Stone in this game and is unbeatable, so only Link can beat him, and Gerudo has to actually seal him away with a Mafuba from Dragon Ball, a green whirling spell that costs him his life. Just like Demon King Piccolo was also sealed away, this time Demon King Ganondorf is sealed away. I mean, retelling the story of Ganondorf being sealed away is nothing out of the ordinary. Ganondorf has been sealed away, or at least some incarnations of Ganondorf have been sealed away many times before, so that's not the problem. But I just took a bit of issue with the way he was being portrayed as so immensely powerful that nobody had a chance against him, even though I think that Zelda should definitely have a chance against him. But whatever, of course, they always have to come back to how Link has to eventually confront him, and those who have played through the game know that Zelda played a large role anyway. Which, by the way, is also one of the many points for why I really like this game, because this game happens within a bootstrap paradox. And I'm a sucker for stories, for good stories at least, that contain a bootstrap paradox, like Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, with Harry knowing that he would succeed in casting the Patronus charm because he has already seen himself casting the Patronus charm, or Back to the Future with Marty McFly singing Johnny Be Good, which would lead to Chuck Berry singing Johnny Be Good, which would lead to Marty knowing it in the first place, and a lot of other very cool bootstrap paradoxes in other stories. If it's in a story which I'm already invested in, it's a very awesome time phenomenon. Now, of course, the overall story is a very traditional Zelda story. The sages are included, and the sages are trying to fight the evil Demon King, and the best they can do is sealing him away. That's really basically just another version of what we have seen times and times before. But the way it is shown, it's something that you need to experience for yourself. The way it is shown is just so convincing. And that's also the reason for why I can forgive a lot of things that this game does. Because if a game or a movie has a somewhat interesting, a somewhat convincing and emotional story, a story that touches me emotionally, then I'm practically sold. And the last scene where you would actually be able to do something in the game, the scene where you're in free fall and have to catch, you know, it's gonna be a spoiler review anyway, you have to catch Zelda. This is, without a doubt, one of the best scenes in all Zelda games. I like this game a lot, and the story contributed to that the most. I'm actually smiling while trying to find words here, but there are not enough words to express how much I liked this. And of course, the very fact how they tried to show the way of how the final chapter is about to happen, with you descending into the depths, and the sages, the friends of Link that he has made, finally catching up with him and helping him with Ganondorf's army, and then the final confrontation with Ganondorf where Link draws the Master Sword, and Ganondorf being pretty much on par with him, and also having those perfect evasion moments, which you also have to counter as well, up to the very last battle, which of course is more of a gimmick battle, but it's also very stylish, where Zelda helps you. This game is a very good game. That's just all I want to say here. Don't think that just because I had some negative things to say about this game, that this game is nothing that I would recommend. I do very much recommend this game. It is an incredible game. That is all I need to say. And these things being said, thank you for watching.